Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, police and prison officers may be in for a pay rise, according to reports that the government is about to lift some of its 1% pay cap on public sector pay. The trades union boss, Frances O'Grady, is about to address the group's Brighton conference, where she's expected to tell the Prime Minister, just get on with it. Well, let's go live now to Brighton and our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who's watching developments. And do you get the sense that the trade unions think they are beginning to win this argument in the public sector?
Yes, they do, but at the same time, Frances O'Grady, who's about to speak, she's the General Secretary of the TUC, has been saying over the past 24 hours there mustn't be any what she calls cherry picking. In other words, some groups of workers getting a pay rise, but not all. And she said it mustn't be a popularity contest. Now, as you've said, Adam, that there are suggestions that perhaps the police and prison officers may be the first to get pay rise. And here actually is Frances O'Grady, so I'm going to hand over Frances O'Grady, General Secretary of the TUC.
Just in case you're wondering, that's water. Congress formally moving the General Council's statement and campaign plan and recording my thanks to the General Council and to all of you delegates, and of course to the President. At a time when women have to fight hard for respect at work and online, we couldn't wish for a stronger champion. So thank you, Mary. Well, what a year we've had. An election result that shook the Conservative Party to its core, a Labour Party on the ascendancy, and strong public support for our call for a new deal at work. But first, I want to say a word about our brilliant emergency service workers too, because sadly this year there has been cause to show that they really are the best of us. Our sympathy and our solidarity goes to the family and friends of those lost and injured at Grenfell, Westminster, London Bridge, Finsbury Park, and at a concert hall full of young music lovers in Manchester too. And our pride and our thanks goes out to those who helped. The first responders, paramedics and emergency control staff, our medics, nurses and hospital support staff, police and community support officers, and never forget our local government and security staff who have to pick up the pieces when politicians fail. And let's not forget either our heroic firefighters, returning to that Grenfell blaze again and again, putting their lives on the line to save others. They are the best of Britain, and on behalf of the whole trade union movement, let's say thank you to them. Now, when I last stood in front of you here, the EU referendum result was just 3 months old. 1 year later, the government still hasn't come up with a proper plan. Like children who haven't done their homework, turning up to school on a Monday morning, let's hear them, Fox, Davis, Johnson, Gove, the Cabinet's answer to Grange Hill. Playing up because they've got a supply teacher. Pretending they're paying attention, we've all been there, pretending they're paying attention while messing about at the back of the class. Yes, the clock is ticking on Brexit, all right, But the government still hasn't published any assessment of what it means for our industries, still no action plan to protect jobs, and still no realistic negotiating strategy. In fact, from what I hear, there's been plenty of offensive but precious little charm. Back home, the Prime Minister says that she will go on and on and on. And she is sticking to that same old script that she can get whatever she wants. She can get the exact same benefits of the single market without playing by any of the rules. That isn't a negotiating strategy. That's a letter to Santa. Unions live in the real world. We say, whichever way people voted in the referendum, what we need now is a Brexit that puts jobs, rights and livelihoods first. And the best way to do that is with a proper deal with the EU, calmly thought through, sensibly negotiated. We support a transition period, not out of principle, but out of sheer pragmatism. And during that time, Britain should play by the rules. It's common sense. The government's hardly begun to sort out the divorce, so there's no chance they're going to sort out brand new terms just for the transition arrangement in just 18 months. The advantage is this. Lorries aren't sat in Dover, our nuclear sites are safe, the workers' rights, which unions fought for, hold good. More certainty for investment and a breathing space to negotiate the best possible long-term deal for the whole of the UK. Now, our movement has some tests of our own for that future deal. It must guarantee the rights of EU nationals who've made the UK their home and those of Britons abroad too. It must protect the Good Friday Agreement. It must guarantee a level playing field for workers' rights now and index-linked into the future. Minimum labour standards, which Britain is sovereign and free, of course, to build and improve on. And it must deliver barrier-free, tariff-free trade and investment, because that protects good, skilled, export-linked jobs that produce the wealth that fund our public services. And while I'm about it, here's another test, Mr. Fox. No dodgy backdoor trade deals to sell off our NHS. Including with a USA president who seems to think that local protesters are just as bad as the neo-fascists marauding through their town. Congress, let there be no mistake. The trade union movement here in the UK stands with our US brothers and sisters in saying we condemn those anti-Semitic, women-hating, white supremacist thugs. And if President Trump sets a foot on our soil, the TUC will be proud to lead a peaceful protest. Let's send a message. Donald Trump, you are not welcome here. So the TUC and unions, we've set out our clear tests for Brexit. That's the shape of the best Brexit deal. That's the Brexit deal that working people need. Staying in the single market and customs union would deliver it, but if there's a better way to deliver the deal, then we're listening. Now, some have said that single market membership means accepting unfettered freedom of movement. To them, I say this. Other members of the single market have different ways to manage migration fairly, like guaranteeing local people good jobs, like making bosses respect the rate for the job and union agreements, like raising the minimum wage and stamping out exploitation. So why doesn't the UK government choose that? And let me say this. I feel this strongly. We must never, ever fall into the trap of scapegoating migrant workers. Migrants aren't the cause of low pay. Just like millions of other people born and raised in the UK, they are the victims of low pay. And the shocking fact is that only 1 in 9 workers in Britain got a real pay rise last year, while top bosses are still raking it in. And let me say this as well, because if ministers really care about pressures on schools and hospitals, then there's a simple solution to that. Stop austerity and stop the cuts. So I challenge all political parties, when it comes to Brexit, don't box yourself in, don't rule anything out, keep all options on the table and put jobs, rights and livelihoods first. Now tonight, MPs are debating the EU withdrawal bill, and it's a chance to hold the government to account. Will the government guarantee to protect and enhance workers' rights? Rights won by unions joining together across borders and over generations? I can't see it in the bill today. And that means that if the bill becomes law unamended, the government can declare open season. Our rights open to attack at a stroke by this government or any future government. Now, I know some people say that won't happen. Even if it's not in the bill, the Prime Minister has said on the record that she would protect rights. But remember, this is the same PM who said she would crack down on 0 hours, put workers on boards and tackle greed at the top. And she hasn't kept a single promise. And she's got a Brexit secretary. He doesn't care about health and safety. We heard his response to the risk of workers' hearing being damaged by Big Ben's 120 decibel bell. He said, just get on with it. So we don't trust them. We put workers first, and we don't want the deregulated tax haven that the government has threatened if it doesn't get its way. Now, instead of presenting us with some kind of Christmas list, the government should be honest about what's at stake, practical about what's achievable, and recognise that the EU referendum bitterly divided this country. And it should be the government's job to show some leadership and bring the country back together, not rub salt in the wound. But in truth, the Prime Minister's top priority isn't to defend Britain's best interests. The Prime Minister's top priority is to stop the Conservative Party falling apart. That's why the rest of us have to step up to the plate, because our top priority is to fight for what's best for workers. It's not easy, but we have to make the case that there is a better way, and we have to stop this government's kamikaze Brexit. Delegates, whatever happens, we still have work to do, building towards the fair and equal society that we all seek, organising for the world that we want to live in. In this movement, we're proud to be working people. We know there's no such thing as an unskilled job. Every job and every worker deserves respect and dignity. Just this year, as we've heard, we saw the power of unions to challenge injustice. When the last government brought in those charges for employment tribunals, faced with a fee of over £1,000, claims fell off a cliff. Not because bosses suddenly stopped behaving badly, but because workers were priced out of justice. And we all know what happened next. One of our unions picked up the cudgels, fought this government all the way to the Supreme Court, and delegates, they won. On behalf of our movement and for all workers who now have a chance of justice, thank you, Unison. Now, as the world of work changes, we've seen the same old exploitation wearing new clothes. Tech giants, more powerful than nation states, unleashing disruption across the globe with no care for the human consequences. We've heard it from the GMB, Amazon, forcing shop floor staff to trek up to 14 miles a day. Apple, sweating workers in China. Uber, screwing drivers it pretends not to employ. And not one of those companies' delegates paying their fair share of taxes. But as someone once said, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And only stronger unions can invent the New Deal at work that Britain so badly needs. Just this month, we've cheered on the brilliant McDonald's workers in the Bakers' Union. Out on strike for the basic dignity of fair pay, guaranteed hours, and recognition of their union. Brave young workers with the courage to win. Proof that, while we welcome Labour's pledge of repeal, that anti-democratic, anti-trade union act won't stop us fighting back. In fact, to coin a phrase, muck strike, we're loving it. So let's hear it for the bakers, let's hear it for Ronnie, let's hear it for all those young workers who deserve our support. But it matters because of this. Every time we expose another bad boss and organise, that's more workers that know unions are on their side, more decent employers who won't get undercut by the bad, and more pressure on the government to change the law. Now, we call the deal that we want to see, we call it our Great Jobs Agenda. For a voice at work, for fair and decent pay, for guaranteed hours, the chance to learn and get on in life, fair treatment and respect, and a safe place to work. Fair and reasonable demands, you may think, but nowhere near the reality for many. For workers who still wait by the phone, hoping for work, just as dockers once waited on the quayside. No regular hours means scrambling to pay the rent and pay the bills. And the boss doesn't even need to go to the bother of sacking you. He can just deactivate you by app. Precious little dignity, precious little control. Treated as throwaway workers with throwaway rights. But I say this to bad bosses. You've seen what this union movement has done in the last few years, exposing your nasty little schemes to avoid paying the minimum wage, holiday pay, sick pay, let alone overtime pay. Our eyes are on you. Trade unionists are standing by your gates, talking to your workers, organising. And either you come and sit at the bargaining table with us, or we will see you in court and on the front pages. Change is coming indeed. Because this union movement, the working people of Britain, won't stand for it any longer. We're taking back control of our working lives. And this year, we're taking the Great Jobs agenda to every MP, every council leader, every mayor, every business, and we are asking them to sign up for Great Jobs, because the Great Jobs agenda unites us all. Take it into your workplace and use it to bargain and recruit. Take it to shopping centres and leisure centres, wherever working people gather. Show what unions can do. And what better place to start than the campaign for our dedicated public servants. A firefighter today earns £2,000 less in real terms than they did in 2010. A midwife's pay has been cut in real terms by £3,000. A prison officer, too often a dangerous job, denied the right to strike, their pay cut by nearly 4. And all the while, the pound in your pocket buying less. Now, the Prime Minister has spoken. She talked about the sacrifice that public service workers have made, as if they had a choice. Public servants weren't given a say in the matter. They've had 7 years of pay freezes and pay cuts imposed on them. They've been forced to work harder for less, while this government has lined the pockets of corporate Britain with tax giveaway after tax giveaway. So much for a country that works for everyone. Now, on October the 17th, we will rally in Parliament Square and we will send a message to Mrs May. 5 million hard-working public servants need it. The public backs it. Now just tell the Treasury to get on with it. No cherry-picking. All public servants deserve a pay rise, and they deserve it now. I want to end with this. All of us stand on a platform that the pioneers of trade unionism built for us. And this coming Congress year will be our 150th as a TUC. Now imagine if our founders were stood here now. I think they'd be proud of us, but I doubt they'd be content. And I'm sure they would ask, what are you doing to make sure that the movement is fit to face the next 150 years? Because you see, our founders, they were the true innovators. They were people who dared to stir it up and make waves. They shattered the conventional wisdom and they built a movement that shaped 2 centuries. They lived through 1 industrial revolution. Our movement lasted 2 more. Now we stand on the cusp of a 4th. Some call it the robot age, when artificial intelligence will lead the way, making some jobs obsolete, yes, but transforming millions more. And workers are going to need new skills on a scale never seen before. So unions have to change because capitalism changes, because business models change, and because working lives change too. We can reinvent a trade unionism that works for the digital age. And that means that we've got to pledge to become, once again, a movement of as well as for young people. The staff who serve your coffee, clean your hotel room, deliver your parcels, and look after your gran. The young mums and dads punished with 0 hours contracts and shift patterns that make planning and paying for childcare nigh impossible. They need unions, but most aren't in them. Not because they don't share our values, but because too often we seem a little too 20th century, maybe, too distant from their lives. So we've spent the last 12 months stepping into the lives of younger workers to find out what kind of trade unionism would really work for them. And in our 150th year, we want to try something new, built from scratch, co-created with today's 20-somethings. New ways to organise, new ways to network, new ways to win, so that we become a movement for everyone once more. You see, I believe that we are the custodians, if you like, of this movement. For our working lives, it's in our care, before we then pass that baton on. And for me, to be a trade unionist is to remember, as the great Scottish Miners' Union Mick McGahey once said, "We are a movement, not a monument." So while we celebrate our past, let's get to it. Let's fight for our future. Let's stay true to our values, but find the courage to change, to grow, to build, and to win. Thank you very much, delegates. Thank you.
General Secretary of the TUC, Frances O'Grady. Frances O'Grady getting a partial standing ovation in the hall. Her main messages were that the government doesn't know what it's doing in what she called a kamikaze Brexit, that the trade unions are able to fight the government, and she talked about the McDonald's strike, saying, "Muck strike, we love it," and looked ahead to the day of protest on the 17th of October in London. And also said that the trade union needs to reinvent the way it organises for the 21st century. Well, Sky's John Craig is in Brighton following the TUC. And John, what do you think is the most powerful message from that speech?
Well, there were two big messages, really, one on Brexit and one on public sector pay. She began by talking about Brexit, as you've said, Adam. She said the government doesn't have a negotiating strategy. She talked about a letter to Santa. She's used that phrase, a kamikaze Brexit, that she was talking about yesterday. I've been talking to a few trade union leaders this morning. They think she's gone rather further than Keir Starmer and Jeremy Corbyn have. Jeremy Corbyn speaks here tomorrow, of course. She was talking about keeping all options open on the single market, customs union and so on. She ended with a powerful message on public sector pay. We are expecting some movement on that from the government later this week. She was saying all public servants deserve a pay rise. They deserve it now. Get on with it, she said. In between, quite a powerful message about Donald Trump as well. She said if President Trump sets a foot on our soil, the TUC will be proud to lead a peaceful process. Donald Trump, you are not welcome here. As ever, from Frances O'Grady, good speech, well received. And, of course, the Brexit and public sector pay are dominating this conference. And, of course, she mentioned the vote in Parliament tonight on Brexit. And, of course, tomorrow it's Jeremy Corbyn here. He speaks here tomorrow afternoon. And, as I say, some of the union leaders I've been talking to think that Mr Corbyn will not go quite as far on Brexit and the single market and the customs union as Frances O'Grady has here today in her speech.
Now, we hear that this week the government is expected to lift the 1% public sector pay cap for police and prison officers. The move will come on the back of reports from independent pay review bodies, which have cited concerns about recruitment and retention in the prison service in particular. The government is under pressure from the unions, Labour and some Tory MPs to lift the cap for public sector workers across the board. In 2010, George Osborne, the then Chancellor, froze public sector pay for 2 years for all but the lowest paid workers. Since 2013, rises have been capped at 1% a year. That's well below the current rate of inflation. The IFS says boosting public sector pay would increase the earnings of 5.1 million workers, but that raising it in line with inflation, around 2.6% over the next 3 or 4 years, would cost an extra £6 or £7 billion. Now, the government says some public sector workers have enjoyed rises above 1% through promotion and pay increments. But 4 unions have introduced motions at this week's Trades Union Congress threatening a coordinated strike if the cap isn't lifted. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said Holyrood will scrap the 1% cap in its own budget next year. And as we expect the UK government to agree to lift it for police and prison officers, The BBC understands the Treasury will recommend easing the cap next year in other areas, like nursing and teaching. Well, we can talk now to Jonathan Cribb from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the people who crunch all the numbers for us. Can you give us a definite answer on who is currently doing better, public sector or private sector workers?
Growth in the private sector is higher than in the public sector, and that's been the case for a few years now. What's crucial to understand, though, is we're now at a point at which, if we look all the way back to pre-crisis in 2007, public and private sector pay has done about the same over that period. So they're both down in real terms about 4 to 5%.
Average earnings, though, don't take into account pension provision, which tends to be better in the public sector, or bonuses, which tend to be better and boost private earnings. So is there any meaningful comparison between the two?
So some measures of pay do include bonuses, so it depends exactly what you're looking at. I think the key thing to look at here is pensions. The public sector still has defined benefit, albeit reformed pensions, and they are significantly more generous on average than in the private sector. However, they have been getting less generous, and public sector employees have had to be putting more into them. And at the same time, a lot of private sector workers are now newly members of pension schemes as a result of automatic enrolment. So it's true that pensions do make a big difference, but the gap is closing, albeit slowly.
So how much will it cost broadly to lift the 1% pay cap across the board for public sector workers?
An easy way to think about this is the public sector pay bill is about £180 billion a year. So for every 1% extra that the government increases pay by for all of those workers, that costs about £1.8 billion. Now, if the government increases pay across the public sector by, say, in line with inflation this year at about 2.6% compared to the 1% pay cap, that would require extra resources for public sector employers, about £2.9 billion.
All right, thank you very much. Kwasi Kwarteng, isn't this just about stealing Labour's clothes? I mean, you would never have done this, even thought about lifting the pay cap, if you had won a majority in the election.
I think that it's not about stealing Labour's clothes, and the simple reason is that if you look at the inflation, you haven't mentioned inflation. But when the policy
2.6%, I said.
When the policy was, he mentioned it very much at the end. When the policy was introduced in 2010, the inflation rate was significantly lower than is the case today. So obviously, if the inflation rates change, these are the kinds of policies that need to be looked at. I think the debate would have been had regardless of what the government's majority would have been had we had a majority of 50.
Well,
so
if that was
this
the
was
case,
something that was going to come up, especially in a place where we are with rising inflation.
Right. Well, if that's the case, inflation has been rising over the last few months, and if it was such a good idea, why did the Conservatives and DUP vote down Labour's Queen's Speech amendment in June, which would have scrapped the cap?
When was the last time that an opposition amendment was ever accepted in a Queen's Speech?
Well,
if that had happened, then everyone would have said that the government was in crisis. That was a big problem. There was no way in which that sort of legislation would be done through an amendment. What we have done is said, look, there is an issue here. Inflation, as you say, is rising. We have to have a debate. We're re-engaging with that debate. And we will see the conclusions of that in terms of policy in the budget and next year.
Well, you say you're not parking your tanks on Labour's lawn. Of course, we will never know, if you had won a majority, whether you would have gone ahead with saying that the pay cap should have been breached, or whether you would support it in that case. You may well have said its austerity will continue. But we are where we are.
Sure.
So what do you think is a fair increase in pay for public sector workers?
All I would say about this, I don't know what the conclusion of the debate will be, but all I can say is that there is a big difference between having a 0% inflation rate, which was the case in the earlier part of this decade, and having an inflation rate which is near 3%.
Sure.
Those circumstances mean that the policy is different and needs to be reviewed.
Yeah, wages aren't keeping up with prices, and people are finding that their household income. So I'm asking you again, how much of a pay rise should they get?
So a 1% pay cap when it's 0% inflation is a different thing from when there's a 3% inflation
And you've
rate.
made that point. How much of a pay rise should they get with those inflation figures in mind?
Well, I'm not here to give a specific figure because that's not where the government is at the moment. What we've said is that there will be a discussion, there's a debate, and we will see where we get to in terms of the budget and next year's provision.
If Labour are in power, would you say that everybody in the public sector, 5.1 million workers, should get a pay rise that goes above 1%?
Well, we believe that we should listen to what the independent pay review bodies are recommending. At the moment, they're constrained because the government has said it has to be 1%.
Sure.
We know that they're saying that actually that is not keeping in step with the rises in the cost of living. They would recommend, if they could, to have bigger increases that would actually be keeping pace with inflation.
And what would Labour say? Would you like it at 2.6%?
Well, we wanted to keep pace with the rising costs, so we want to listen to exactly what those pay review bodies would say. I mean, that seems to be what they're suggesting. But can I just say, we've been trying to say this for many months. I came into the Parliament in June, and I remember around then, July, repeatedly, many of my colleagues trying to say to Theresa May, don't you recognise there's such a thing as in-work poverty in the public sector and private sector, of course, the minimum wage being too low, but in the public sector.
All right.
And she just wouldn't accept it.
All right.
So it's good to change your position, but it's taken too long.
We're debating this. I mean, what the problems the government had was that there was no way that the government was going to change policy in response to demonstrations. There was a proper process through which we came up with policy.
But it's not just demonstration. With all due respect, it's due to massive staff shortages in some areas. I mean, where I represent in Oxford, but many other parts of the country as well, we can't get enough nurses. We can't get enough people to work in our NHS. That's about a third of the people who are hit by this pay cut working in the NHS.
Well, let's take the costs, because, as you say, you would award a pay rise as a Labour MP. You would support probably inflation levels of pay rises. And in the manifesto, it would mean that it would cost about £9.2 billion a year by 2021-22. How would you pay for that?
Well, we've been very clear on how we'd pay for it. Unlike the Conservatives, at the last general election, we actually had a document that set out exactly where we get that funding from. We wouldn't be having the cuts in corporation tax that the government has decided to go ahead with. We also wouldn't have given the DUP £1 billion. I know that's only one part of what would be needed to pay for it. But I would just say, in relation to the figures we were told about before, some of those figures include national insurance, which of course goes back into the government's pocket.
So IFS, who we just spoke to earlier, said they didn't add up those figures. They were very clear about it. It is independent, and they said the figures in the Labour manifesto, and I take your point, you did have costings there, didn't add up in terms of increasing public sector pay at rates of inflation, that £9.2 billion couldn't be found in the way you said by 2021-22. So is there a problem? Is there a problem that people will think it's the same old Labour Party just spending galore?
Well, you're saying that, but your party wasn't willing to provide any figures. We're happy to have others scrutinise our figures. We set them out.
What do you say when they say they don't add up?
We need to go and look at them again. I know that Labour contested some of the methodology that had been used. As I said, around this, there is a question about whether you include national insurance contributions or not. But at least we gave people the choice, so they could look at it and they could take a decision.
And people voted, and a lot of people voted for that. And that's comes back to my original question, which is why you've been persuaded to look at this.
The current situation, which never gets mentioned or hasn't been mentioned in your debate, is that we're borrowing £1 billion a week. The government is borrowing £1 billion a week. The Labour proposal, as the IFS suggested, has a £9 billion black hole on top of the £1 billion a week that we're borrowing just to pay for the government.
So you're not really in favour of this, are you, Kwasi Kwarteng?
What I'm saying is that there is a huge cost to it, and we have to accommodate that.
And the Conservatives will lose what some people would say is their reputation for fiscal prudence if they bridge the gap.
That's why we're having a debate. Right. That's why we're having a debate.
And you're not in favour of it?
That's why we're having a debate. No, I'm saying that that's why we're reviewing it. We accept two aspects of this. We accept that inflation means that there is a squeeze on living standards, but we also accept there is a huge borrowing requirement. Labour, I'm afraid, refuses to acknowledge that there is a problem with increasing debt.
I'll come to
that's the heart of their problem.
I'll come to you in a moment. Why would it be, though, initially a pay rise above 1% for police and prison officers. Is this a sort of divide and rule strategy?
It's not a divide and rule strategy. I mean, a lot of the policy is informed, as you said, by shortages. We know
in the prison service, but also in nursing as well.
We know that, I don't know what the offer will be on these various sectors, but we know that there are shortages in the prison service, and so it makes sense, I think, if you are going to lift the cap, to look at the places where you have shortages.
Why should highly paid civil servants, judges or managers, get inflation-busting pay rises or inflation-level pay rises?
Well, there is an independent peer review body that looks into these issues, that decides what the different
That's not the answer to my question, is why should they, highly paid civil servants, get those levels of pay rise?
Well, I don't believe that politicians should be making these decisions about exactly where the spending should go on different individuals. I think that would be wrong, actually.
So you do think highly paid people should get those sorts of...
I think we need to have a public service and a public sector that works. That actually would be more efficient than the situation we have at the moment, where our public services are creaking at the seams, and it's actually proving more expensive. I mean, I see people coming in, I'm sure you have the same, because our mental health services aren't working, we've got greater problems with homelessness, local authorities have to pick up the tab on all of that. We've got more expensive systems because funding isn't being allocated
We're going
properly.
to leave it there.
You have to look at the debt side, which you never do.
Yes, we do. You're the ones who keep changing your targets on it, with respect.
Now, we'll come back to this later on in the programme. You'd be delighted to know. But just briefly, John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, says if the unions go on strike over this, that Labour will join them on the picket line. Will you be there?
I would be, because I think they've got a legitimate claim, and it's one which is backed by experts and which the independent peer review bodies seem to have been supporting as well, privately rather than publicly.
The Trades Union Congress is holding its annual conference in Brighton, and in the last hour, General Secretary Frances O'Grady has been addressing delegates. She has called on all political parties not to rule out staying in the single market once the UK has left the EU.
Now, some have said that single market membership means accepting unfettered freedom of movement. To them I say this: other members of the single market have different ways to manage migration fairly, like guaranteeing local people good jobs, like making bosses respect the rate for the job and union agreements, like raising the minimum wage and stamping out exploitation. So why doesn't the UK government choose that?
And as if by magic, we're joined now from Brighton by the General Secretary of the TUC, Frances O'Grady. Welcome to the Daily Politics, Frances. Now, we have been discussing about MPs who are set to vote on the EU withdrawal bill tonight. Is the position of the TUC that you represent that MPs should vote for or against it?
Oh, we're worried about the power grab that this bill represents and what that means for workers' rights. Because if ministers can get away with watering down workers' rights without proper scrutiny and parliamentary debate, that's a problem for agency workers, part-time workers, anybody who relies on those rights.
So should they vote for or against it?
Oh, Labour Party tactics are up to them.
No, but what's the TUC to MPs from all parties?
Well, our message to all parties is that we need a Brexit. We know we're out of the EU, but we need a Brexit that puts jobs, livelihoods and workers' rights first.
Right. I don't think anyone would disagree with you on that, Frances O'Grady. I don't think anyone would disagree with you on that. So
I'm pleased to hear that.
So you still haven't been brave enough to tell me... Yes, unanimous. OK, we've got consensus. But you still haven't been brave enough to tell me whether you would advise, as the TUC, to vote against that bill or vote for it in order to protect those workers' rights.
My understanding is that the opposition have put down some very sensible amendments seeking those guarantees on workers' rights, which we're seeking too. So obviously we'll be watching very closely to see how the vote goes. But if it goes through unamended, that bill does pose a threat to workers' rights in the future. If not this government, then another government.
All right, well, let's go on to the issue of pay. Because we've also been discussing the public sector pay cap being lifted. Why has it taken 7 years of lobbying by the TUC, amongst others, for a policy change? You clearly haven't been very effective.
Well, public servants are really angry that they have waited 7 long years, and we have all been doing our best to make the case, a strong case, that workers should be treated fairly. They should be paid the rate for the job. Ambulance drivers, firefighters, midwives shouldn't have to put up with real cuts in their pay to the tune of thousands of pounds since 2010. And frankly, we don't want to read about it in the press. The Prime Minister should tell the Chancellor, get on with it. Pay isn't a popularity contest. Make sure that there's a decent pay increase for public service workers across the board.
So what are you going to do if you don't get that? If you don't get a public sector pay increase across the board, will you join strikes?
Striking is always a last resort, and negotiation and consultation with us in respect of pay bodies is the best way forward. But I have to say this, that I think any group of workers called heroes one day, treated so badly for the past 7 years, have a right to feel angry.
Right.
And certainly we can't rule out action in the future if the government refuses to listen.
Right, so you are prepared to do that. After 7 years of failing to get this key issue that you have supported at the top of the policy agenda, now there is a change, which I suggest to you is as a result of Jeremy Corbyn and the success that he and the Labour Party had in the general election. Nothing really to do with the TUC at all.
Oh, I think you'll find that even Conservative MPs admit that when they're on the doorstep talking to our members, teachers, healthcare assistants, cleaners, porters, they heard the strength of that feeling, that they're not prepared to wait any longer. Public servants are a team. They don't want a pick and mix approach. Somebody in a uniform gets a pay increase, somebody they rely on in the control room gets nothing. They want a decent pay increase across the board.
Sure,
and of course,
I understand that, but
we're willing to talk to government.
Right, but I'm talking about the impact that the TUC still has today in 2017. Why is union membership plunging to an all-time low?
Well, it's certainly not plunging by any stretch.
Well,
I don't think any other organisation, nearly 6 million strong, would be described as plunging. We
but
know
you lost
we've got work to do, and by the way,
275,000 members. And as I say, you didn't manage to get this issue onto the agenda. And, you know, people, a bit like Len McCluskey at Unite, are just saying you're too timid. You're not militant enough. That's why you have failed, where Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party have succeeded.
1 million public sector jobs have been cut since 2010, so we need to put that in perspective. But I'm certainly not complacent, and that's why we've been talking about today how we're going to reach out and organise a new generation of workers, as we're doing at McDonald's, Sports Direct, ASOS. The names are mounting up now, and more importantly, that we're going to shine a light on those employers who fail to pay the minimum wage, fail to treat their workers with respect, fail to give them guaranteed hours and stick them on 0 hours contract. I feel the trade union movement is in good form and in good heart. We know we've got a big job to do. I very much hope that on public sector pay, the government will see sense and scrap that cap.
Did you resent Len McCluskey's comment that the TUC has been too timid?
The TUC is all unions, and of course we should challenge ourselves. You know, our job is to raise people's expectations that every worker should be treated fairly, and believe you me, I think we're up for it.
There you go, fighting talk. Frances O'Grady, thank you very much from the TUC conference in Brighton. You said earlier that it is something that you would consider. John McDonnell said he would join the picket line, and actually Frances O'Grady said she understood the anger from workers. If it comes to that, will you be on the picket line with all these workers?
Well, I think it always is a last resort, but just picking up on the discussion you've just had, I think the reason why it's become such a big issue now is because people feel it's very hypocritical what's happened. Those public sector workers have been told for so long, there's no money anywhere, we can't find it, you know, you've got to cope with this pain. And then suddenly £1 billion plucked out of the air from the back of the sofa to give to the DUP. People resent that. They resent the tax cuts that are occurring for some of the richest people, some of the biggest corporations, and that's why I think they now say we need to have that rise.
And there is another point that Frances O'Grady makes when she talks about a Brexit for workers and to protect workers' rights. The government's new chief trade negotiator, Crawford Faulkner, has backed proposals to put, as he says it, our domestic regulations on the table in a negotiation. Should our domestic regulations, our workers' rights, our protections and health and safety be on the table, up for negotiation?
Obviously, he's a professional negotiator. I don't know where he's coming from in that particular
But he's the government's new chief trade negotiator.
Brexit,
is he going to trade away workers' rights?
In terms of the campaign which I was involved in, we always said, this is the pro-Brexit campaign, we always said that we would try and enshrine and protect workers' rights. This wasn't simply a question of having a bonfire of rights and duties. This was something about sovereignty. And of course, once we do get a sovereign parliament where we don't have as much EU or any EU interference, we can have a debate, as we used to do, about the nature of workers' rights, about the nature of the social provision.
So they could be on the table.
That we can provide as a country. I'm not sure that they're on the table when you're doing a bilateral negotiation with the EU. But the whole point about parliamentary sovereignty, the whole point about our democracy is that we can have, Annalise and I can have these discussions in British politics.
Let's leave it there.
And it won't surprise you to hear that Brexit dominated proceedings at the TUC annual conference. The General Secretary, Francis O'Grady, has called on politicians from all parties not to rule out staying inside the single market after Britain leaves the EU. Our political correspondent Ian Watson reports.
As Brexit looms, navigating our future relationship with the EU just across the Channel is proving tricky. Technically, the TUC is calling on all politicians to consider staying inside the single market permanently, even if that means fewer controls and migration. But make no mistake, their message is predominantly aimed at Labour.
When it comes to Brexit, don't box yourself in, don't rule anything out, keep all options on the table and put jobs, rights and livelihoods first.
Not everything at the TUC happens on the conference floor. In what are smoke-free rather than smoke-filled rooms these days, some of the unions which fund the Labour Party have been putting real pressure on Jeremy Corbyn. Their first victory, as they would see it, was getting him to sign up to single market membership during a transition period. But now they want him to go further, and today it certainly sounded like they were having some success.
There has to be a trade relationship with Europe, whether that is formally within the single market or whether that is an agreement to trade within the single market, I think is open for discussion and negotiation.
Labour spokespeople were quick to clarify that this didn't signal a change in policy, but some Brexit-backing unions wanted to move in the other direction.
We want to be in a position where leave means leave, and there are people around who seem to be wanting to use the single market as a Trojan horse to keep in Europe.
But the TUC's leadership is hoping to make the political weather on Brexit. They're pushing for more clear blue water between Labour and the government on the single market. Ian Watson, BBC News, Brighton.
With reports that the government might be about to lift the 1% pay cap on police and prison officers' wages, trade union leaders are ratcheting up the pressure for all public service workers to be included. 3 unions are to consult their members about holding strikes, and the leader of the TUC said the government must not cherry-pick which type of worker should be allowed to breach the cap.
A prison officer, a nurse and an ambulance worker walk into a bar, and right now all of them feel their pay is the joke.
It's when you realise in real terms what it is that you've lost.
But the government is expected to lift the pay cap for one of them. Prison officers and police could get a rise above 1%, but the others must wait.
To lose out on that pay rise year in, year out, it's been quite hard sucker punch to take, you know, so...
Now there's some hope?
Possibly, yeah. Nurses are not special, paramedics and prison officers aren't special. We all work together for the good of the public, so we all deserve it.
Their unions think so, applauding 2 of them on stage today for their work in the Manchester bombing and Grenfell fire. As the TUC conference backed strikes, if necessary, to end the pay cap for everyone.
The public backs it. Now just tell the Treasury to get on with it. No cherry picking. All public servants deserve a pay rise, and they deserve it now.
But even if years of protests lead to a rise, it might not keep pace with inflation. That would be expensive.
If the government were to increase pay in line with inflation instead of 1%, that would cost about £2.8 billion next year alone.
Our prison officer should find out this week what rise he'll get. It may be a while before other public sector workers are celebrating with him. Paul Brandt, News at 10, Brighton.
Well, our political editor Robert Pesson joins us now from Westminster with news about that pay cut. Robert, I know the Brexit debate is going on behind you, but what have you been able to find out tonight about this issue of public sector pay?
So either tomorrow or Wednesday, government's still making up its mind. They will announce the new pay deals for prison officers and for the police. And the pay rises for both will be above 1%, above that pay cap, but below 2%. Now, crucially, no decision has yet been made about whether extra public money is going to be found to fund these pay deals. So there is a risk that both the prison service and the police will have to fund these pay rises by making savings elsewhere, and that will be controversial. But I think the sort of big headline is that if they are getting, and as I say, I'm reliably told they will be getting more than 1%, I think that does mean that across the board we can now expect a significant softening of that 1% pay gap. When we get to the budget, there will be guidance given to the so-called pay review boards about what they should be recommending for 2018 pay for all public sector workers. And I think we can now be reasonably confident that although the pay cap of 1% won't be massively lifted, I think that 1% ceiling, I think we can be now confident, is dead.
Robert, thanks very much indeed.